An aspect of modernity that I think people overlook is how large and prominent the middle class is, especially compared to ages gone by. If you listen to politicians, that is the sole political concern many of them have. If you think about the kind of slogans that come up come election time, fighting for the middle class, creating middle class jobs, helping middle class families, working hard for the middle class, stuff like that. The whole political system seems geared towards increasing the size of the middle class as a proportion of society and maintaining the people who are already at that standard. Even more so than aspiring to be upper class, people aspire to be part of the middle class. That's seen as the ideal. In fact, in many Western countries, it's a majority of the population, both in terms of people who consider themselves to be middle class and those who could be considered middle class in a historically correct sense. A critical part of understanding how the modern world came to be is to understand how the middle class rose, how it went from being a tiny subsection of society to become, in many cases, the dominant political force that controls most of the modern West. Now, before we go further, let's define some terms. What do I mean by the middle class? How does one define the middle class? Well, the traditional definition, at least from the way I view it, is that the middle class are those who have property and education, but not political power, or not very much in the way of political power. And by this definition, many people in the middle class can be exceedingly wealthy. That's where the idea of the upper middle class comes from. People who are as wealthy or even more wealthy than the upper class, but lack the same privileges and political power. So you can be a multi-millionaire but still be part of the middle class because maybe you have that money in terms of investments, but you don't have any real pull or influence on the government. While not exclusively, the middle class is often historically associated with white-collar jobs, be it lawyers, doctors, teachers, scribes, bureaucrats, merchants. They're people who have money and very often some form of education, but they lack true political power. And for that reason, they're inherently the most unstable portion of society. Because let's think about this for a minute. If you're a peasant, you're barely eking out a living. You might very well be illiterate. You don't really think about these grand political ideas. You don't think about things like liberty or representation or democracy. Your primary concern is going to church and feeding your family. You need a certain degree of education in order to dream these bigger dreams. Also, like I said, peasants are busy with other stuff. They're busy trying to feed their families. If they leave their farms to go do political action work, then the crops aren't going to get harvested and their family starves. And then you look at the upper class. The upper class is happy with the current situation. Not that many revolutions are led by upper class people. The times when it does happen, it's often the upper class rebelling against an autocracy in which even they don't have political power. So they may be wealthy and they may be nobles, but in a sense they kind of are shoved into that middle class position. Thus, any change to the social structure is most likely to benefit the middle class. The lower class lacks the imagination and the organization to rule, and the upper class is kind of happy with how things are. So if you look at it both historically and in the modern day, most movements, be it communism, fascism, Islamism, liberalism, etc., tend to be primarily created by and led by members of the middle class. So let me provide some examples to kind of prove my point. Many of history's greatest revolutionaries come from a middle class position, normally as a form of being a white-collar worker. So let's just go through a couple. Che Guevara was a dentist. Maximilien Robespierre was a lawyer. Gandhi was a lawyer. Mao Zedong was a school teacher and librarian. Pol Pot was a school teacher. Lenin was a lawyer. Castro was a lawyer. And Michael Collins was a clerk at a bank. So if we look at it, all these famous people came from that sort of position I was talking about. They had professions that probably provided them with a pretty decent living, but they lacked any sort of real political power under the systems that they lived in. And once again, you can still be wealthy or even a noble and be in this position. A lot of history's greatest revolutionaries came from the lower nobility or were very wealthy. Just to go through a few, look at the leaders of the American Revolution. You have Washington, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. These people were all very wealthy and successful. Washington was a huge landowner. He was in many ways kind of the American equivalent of a aristocrat. Jefferson was very wealthy. Benjamin Franklin was a very successful inventor and I guess you could just say businessman. And these were, in most societies, you would think of these people as being the top of the ladder. But as it was a colonial society, they didn't really exert the same amount of influence that they would if they had been nobility in Britain. They saw it as they had a lot to gain if the existing political system was overthrown, and they were able to create something in its place, which they were. If you look at the leaders of the revolution, many of them went on to be ministers, secretaries, presidents, Supreme Court justices. Most of them gained a great deal of political power from the revolution, and their class kind of became the new ruling class within America. Looking at some other revolutionary leaders, you have Simón Bolívar, who was a Creole. How it worked in the Spanish colonies was the highest class were peninsulars, who were people who were born in Spain, and they were considered to be more personally loyal to the Spanish crown than the Creoles, who were white settlers, who were Spanish citizens, but they were barred from most of the higher offices within the colonies, and they faced certain forms of legal discrimination. So Bolivar came from this class, and his family were actually exceedingly wealthy. He owned multiple plantations. He was able to go to Europe and go on a big tour. But because he was a colonial, because he was a Creole, he was denied any sort of real political power. And the Latin American independence movement was in many ways a middle-class movement. It was led by the Creoles and the merchants and the other middle and upper middle-class people in Latin America who were tired of being subject to the Spanish crown and tired of royal governors and wanted to rule personally. In many cases within Latin America, the lower class, especially if they were Indios or blacks, were very much in favor of staying with the crown because the crown provided them with certain protections that they often weren't able to enforce, but the crown at least attempted to protect them, and they preferred being ruled by the Spanish crown rather than being ruled by the local gentry who often enslaved and abused them personally. Some other examples include Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a noble but came from a rather poor kind of backcountry noble family in Corsica, and Oliver Cromwell, who came from a middle-class family that was still technically part of the gentry. Once again, this is not to say that all social movements are solely a product of the middle class, or that all revolutionaries are a product of the middle class. It's just, I think in terms of social stability, we have this image of the lower classes as rising up and overthrowing their rulers. When in many cases, it's the middle class who want to overthrow the rulers and establish themselves as the new ruling class. So before we get into how the middle class emerged and what impact it had, let's take a look at if there are any historical examples of this. As I said, historically, most societies have had an elite, generally speaking, nobility or some sort of priesthood, and then everybody else were peasants. And the middle class people you did have, like bureaucrats or craftsmen or whoever, tended to be a very small, largely irrelevant percentage of the population. But there were a couple societies historically, mainly urban ones, that did have a substantial middle class. Probably the most noticeable one was Rome, at least during the Republican era. Now, it's kind of funny because today the term pleb is used as an insult, but in reality, the plebs were not the lowest rung in Roman society. They were actually one of the highest. You see, of the people who were actually Roman citizens, there was a number of different subclasses. Ignoring things like the proletariat, generally speaking, the two major ones were the patricians and the plebeians. Now, both of them were Roman citizens, and both of them had the right to vote, to elect magistrates. They had all the protections of the Roman constitution. But whereas all patricians were nobility, not all plebeians were nobility. Yes, there were plebeian nobles, a lot of them in fact. probably the most famous of whom was Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome, who came from a plebeian family. Cicero was from a plebeian family. Pompey was from a plebeian family. That being said, within Rome, since the beginning, as far back as the Kingdom of Rome, you had an issue called the conflict of the orders, in which the more numerous plebs and the more powerful patricians struggled against each other for power. During the early Republic, occasionally when the plebs felt that their situation had become intolerable, they would engage in a secession. That would mean that all the plebs would leave Rome, or what other cities the Republic controlled, and they would stay outside of the city until the patricians agreed to their demands. So everything would come to a halt. All the trade would come to a halt. There wouldn't be craftsmen anymore. They made up the vast majority of the Roman army, at least at first, and they would use this as a way to force the patricians to give in to their demands. So very early on, some of their demands were that they would also be allowed to vote, and they would also be allowed to elect their own magistrates, including the extremely powerful tribune of the plebs. Eventually, it also became custom to have one of the consuls be a plebeian. So generally, there'd be one patrician consul and one plebeian consul. Over time, the conflict of the orders led to codification of Roman law, more rights for the individual citizen, more power to the democratically elected assemblies. Keep in mind, in terms of Roman democracy, it was probably only something like 10% of the population could vote. But my point being, because there was a substantial middle class within that society, the middle class had a desire for social change. And while not a perfect metaphor, I think in a lot of ways this does echo what we're going to see later on with the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. One of the things that really destabilized the later Republic was, as Augustus put it, the slaves have all the work and the patricians have all the land. So the vast majority of the land within the Roman Republic, and I guess by that point the Roman Empire, was owned by patricians. But because the Roman state had such a dependence on slavery, I've never been able to find exact statistics on what percentage of the Roman population was enslaved, but it was very large. In a lot of cases, the plebeians didn't really have much to do. Sure, some of them were merchants or shopkeepers or things like that. But in a lot of cases, they could either join the army or just go on welfare. And in part because Rome had so much territory and so many slaves, they could afford to just give out bread and money and wine and stuff to the citizens of Rome. So this further made the situation worse, because not only did you have a decently well-educated portion of the population who had at least some money and were decently fed, but had a whole bunch of time on their hands and didn't really have any hope for a better life. Sure, they could join the army, but that was 25 years, and very often the land they got was not particularly good. So that's not a very good environment for a stable society. And interestingly enough, you do see this desire for a constitution, for rule of law, for at least some form of democracy, for representation within most societies in history that have had a sizable middle class, at least in the Western world. I mean, think about it. Greece was very similar to this. Once again, in part, the middle class was allowed to exist because there was such a large slave population. But you did have elected councils, you did have public courts, you did have the rule of law, or at least the ideal of the rule of law. And within the republics that existed during the medieval era and the Renaissance, like Venice or Florence, once again, you did have a lot of these similar conventions that we would eventually see in the modern day. Of course, in most of these states, only the gentry or only the wealthy could vote. But once again, there is this need for some sort of representation, for some sort of rule of law, for some sort of restriction on the ruling class's power. You see this in medieval republics, you see this in the Dutch Republic, you see this within the imperial cities. This is something very common, and it would kind of only become more common as the middle class spread throughout the Western world. So where did the middle class come from? Why did we get more and more people in this emerging class as time went on? Because historically, most people have been subsistence farmers, and if they worked a profession like a shoemaker, they were often very poor, they just had steady work. I mean, think of the world today. We have middle-class jobs that no one would have even thought of. Advertising, market research, programming, stockbroker, and a massive, massive entertainment industry. A lot of these things would just be incoherent or incomprehensible to people in the past. That such a large percentage of the population would not only not be farming, but would not be working in physical tasks at all. So I would say the two biggest reasons for this was the invention of the printing press and the improvement of technology, particularly with regards to agriculture. Historically, books had been extremely expensive because people had to manually copy them. And if you ever had to write lines in school or write an essay, you know how long that takes and how much it hurts your head and how difficult it is. So imagine how long it would take somebody to copy a Bible, let alone having to correct mistakes, maybe redoing pages. Maybe they had some fancy illustrations or calligraphy, and it would take a huge amount of time and a huge amount of money to do this. And as a result, books were unaffordable to anyone but maybe educational institutions, the church, and extremely wealthy people. But with the printing press, that changed. Books were still expensive, but people who had a little bit of money could buy one, or maybe they could open a library up, and they could pool their money together and they could buy a bunch of books, and then people could borrow them and everyone could read them. As printing technology got better, you eventually also got things like newspapers, flyers, instructions, things like this, all these aspects of society that you had to be able to read to participate in. Another one of, in the West at least, the big forces that pushed towards literacy was in Protestantism. There's a very big emphasis on reading the Bible. You have to be able to read the Bible for yourself, and to read that you have to be literate. And because the Bible is a pretty dense book that has a lot of big words in it, you have to be fairly literate to be able to even attempt to read it. So literacy was always a very large priority among Protestant communities. And once you get into American settlers, there was near universal literacy among males at least, very early on, before even the Revolution, depending on the portion of the country that you were living in, and a lot of that comes from the desire to read the Bible. Now, the idea of literacy being a good thing isn't just an invention of the modern era. Pretty much as soon as people invented writing back in ancient Mesopotamia, the response was, this is the greatest thing ever. We need to get as many literate people as possible and just start writing stuff down. And it took a long time before things like novels developed, but people immediately saw that this was a very effective tool. Because, I mean, let's just think of a couple things, like a ledger. Like you have a warehouse, you have a big storage place, and you can write down what's in it. You can write down where it is. You can do bookkeeping. You can say, okay, X person took this out. You can write bills of sale. You can write contracts. Like you two can write a contract and sign it and leave it at a local court. The possibilities were endless, and people very quickly adopted this. Bureaucracies emerged almost from the start in Mesopotamian city-states because it was just so useful. A good example of this is discussed in the following clip.
The content of the tablet is very simple. It simply mentions a large quantity, 22 jars, of lard or pig's fat. It gives the name of the responsible official, and it states that this fat was dispensed in the city of Zabala.
And with the printing press, this became available to an increasingly large amount of the population. You also had advancements in technology, particularly with regards to agriculture. If you think about it today, very few people in the West are involved within the agricultural sector, but they're able to produce so much food that a lot of it goes to waste. That's just how much more efficient it's gotten. It's gone from like 80% of the population working on farms to like 5% or less of the population working on farms. And those people producing far more than that 80% ever did. Traditionally, food was most of a family's income. Like, people could barely get enough to eat in order to keep alive. Nowadays, the problem we have in most Western countries is food is so cheap and so widely available that obesity is a much bigger problem than hunger. So that being said, you suddenly had a lot of life's costs got a lot cheaper, and there was less of a demand for people to work these farm jobs. So what logically came about is they had to find something for these people to do. And if you think about it today, how useful and how productive is it to be able to read? Pretty much everything in modern society you would need requires reading. And even if you're in a very lowly position, like, I don't know, if you're a manual laborer or a farmer or anything, being able to read things like instructions, weather reports, studies about crops, things like that, being able to do your own accounting, your own bookkeeping, all of these things make you enormously more productive. And traditionally what happens is the more productive a society gets, the more specialized the roles are. Because like in a hunter-gatherer society, probably everyone would do everything. But if you start to have an agricultural society, okay, so you have the people who are really good at growing things, and they're very efficient at it. And because they're able to be efficient at it, you can have other people who can do things like make horseshoes or make barrels or make wagon wheels or that kind of thing. And the more and more efficient production gets heading into the modern era, the more and more specific and strange the roles are that people can undertake. And this combined with, like I said, food became a lot cheaper once we get to the Industrial Revolution. Things like clothing, textiles become very inexpensive. I mean, if you think about clothing, if you don't want to go with something fancy, if you just want to go to Goodwill, you can buy all the clothing you'd want for just dollars. Like on a minimum wage job, you can buy a closet full of clothing. Once again, it's not fancy, but compared to the often rags people were wearing back then, it's unique. It's very strange in terms of history. Most people nowadays have access to things like electricity. They have a very wide variety of food in their diet. Like, for example, the Irish pretty much only ate potatoes. A lot of people historically only ate locally grown vegetables and wheat. And meat was something that was very difficult to come by, and nowadays everybody can eat meat. Meat is still more expensive than vegetables, but it's very affordable, and it's a much larger portion of people's diet. My point being that the total amount of wealth in society expanded so much during the agricultural and the industrial revolution that you were able to support a much larger middle class and a much more specialized portion of the population. You also have things like more advanced forms of communication and transportation. International trade becomes a lot easier. You need more people, like I said, as technology expands, being engineers or mechanics or that kind of thing. And one of the things that comes with having a more literate population is they start to develop more of an imagination. They start to question why things are the way they are and wonder, can't things be better? Like within Moscow, during the last bit of the Tsarist regime, literacy spread very rapidly among the working class. And it's kind of funny because the Russian government obviously censored most books, anything political, but people were still reading Jules Verne, they were still reading Alice in Wonderland, and other things that the regime didn't think were dangerous. But people read them and they're like, wow, in England, there's like middle class people and they're having tea parties, and people in these countries are getting more than us to eat, and things like that. Why can't we have that here? And just kind of that exposure, they started to dream of better things. They started to try to come up with their own solutions. They just said, well, why doesn't the Tsar just do this? Why doesn't he just give us rights? That kind of thing. They weren't just content anymore to leave politics to the ruling class because they had an understanding of it themselves. In many ways, they felt they had a better understanding. Because where a lot of nobility would just spend their days gambling or playing cards or shooting or buying luxurious stuff and just living off of the rents they were collecting from land that they didn't really actively administer or improve, you had these middle class people and they were building things. They were writing books, they were doing research, and they started to say, why do we need these aristocrats? Maybe it's our turn for a place in the sun. We are the driving engine of society. It's time for them to go and for us to take over. And if you look at it, let's just look at a couple revolutions and see who were the driving forces. Within the French Revolution, like you said, you had the Jacobins, you had people like Napoleon, you had people like Robespierre, who were all members of the middle class or the upper middle class. If you look at China, people like Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong and Sun Yat-sen were from the middle class. They tended to be fairly well educated, but they weren't part of the ruling elite. They weren't part of the formal gentry. And so they were exposed to all of these ideas. be they liberalism, democracy. Sun Yat-sen traveled all over the world and saw how other societies were, and he began to dream of something bigger, of something better, of something fundamentally different. It was kind of when you started to have the end of isolation and kind of started being exposed to one another, they really started to question why things were the way they were and if things couldn't be made better for them personally and for their society. As previously mentioned, the American Revolution was led by the middle class and the upper middle class. Most of the people involved in it were literate. I mean, think about it. People widely read the Constitution, people read Tom Paine's work, the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers. These were debates that the average person took part in. America had a very large middle class, much larger than I would imagine just about any other society in human history had. And in many ways, that's still the case. In part just because there was so many resources. Pretty much anybody could go and get a big parcel of decently fertile land, and in a couple of generations, they'd become a fairly successful independent farmer. Russia was also similar to this, but probably an even more extreme example. It's kind of funny because they did have a couple elections in Russia prior to the revolution. And generally speaking, right-wing parties won virtually no seats. I guess the rightmost party that you had was maybe the Cadets, who were classical liberals. But generally speaking, the right didn't do very well in Russian elections, even among the middle and ostensibly upper class. I mean, you'd think they could get a couple dozen seats for an Orthodox or nationalist party, but generally speaking, no. Most people either voted for the Socialist Revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, or the Social Democrats. Some form of left-wing socialism was almost always the dominant party, regardless of how many elections they had. And by the time you have the white movement, while there were conservatives in the white movement, a lot of them were liberals. A lot of them were or socialists or just people who didn't like the Bolsheviks. There's this idea that the white movement was all monarchists and was all reactionaries. Those people were all part of the white movement, but the white movement was much broader than that. And regardless of how you feel about the Soviet Union, and regardless about how you feel about communism and what wound up happening, I think the fact that very few people within the society were willing to fight for the Tsar's rights, and it really came down to, do we want Russia to be a parliamentary democracy similar to the rest of the West, or do we want Russia to be a communist state and to try something completely new? Very few people, I know some of the white generals were monarchists, but in general, there wasn't that much of a force to bring things back to the way they were. As previously mentioned, most Latin American revolutions were led by the criollos, or the upper middle class. In some cases, it was actually led, we'll talk about this in a future episode, but Spain during the early 19th century kept going back and forth between extreme liberalism and extreme reaction. And that really spooked a lot of people in the colonies. So you had people who would revolt and declare independence because of the liberalism, and people who would revolt and declare independence because of the reaction. So that brings us to the present and what I like to call the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. This for a moment. Who in our society have the most power? Is there a class or a group of people who holds more or less the power of life and death, the power of compulsion, executive power, what the Romans would call imperium, over the rest of us? And there are three main groups that come immediately to mind: the judiciary, bureaucracy, and corporations. Now, all of these, if you look at it and who tends to wind up leading these, very often the people who make up these positions, who become a minister or become a judge or even become an executive in a company, they don't come from some like blue blood line. They don't come from a manor home. They don't come from like 10 generations of whatever. They're very often a kid who was especially ambitious or intelligent or lucky, and they were able to rise up in the social hierarchy. So there is, in a sense, a meritocracy. The problem with meritocracies, though, is people's definition of merit is very different. Some people might say that just being blindly loyal is a form of merit. Some people might say the ability to conform is a form of merit. In our current society, merit is often defined as the ability to be as socially liberal as possible, is kind of what the merit is based on. So you do have people say, I wish we had a meritocracy. I think we should have a meritocracy. that would be better. But if you really think about it, that is what we have. People who can perform the best in school, who are the best at business, who are the best at, I don't know how you necessarily get into the bureaucracy, acing the civil service examinations or that kind of thing, or LSAT. There is a lot of meritocratic aspects. Whether or not you think any of the tests that allow people to get into these positions are legitimate or worth anything is kind of irrelevant. The point is that we as a society view power as something that is gained as a result of personal achievement and not something that's passed down to you by God or by who your family was. And this dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is why elections often don't matter. And you hear this talked about a lot. Oh, it doesn't matter that Trump won. He can't do anything. It doesn't matter that the Conservative Party's in power. They can't actually cut taxes. They can't actually cut the rate of spending, etc. Probably the most famous line was something that was said to John Major.
We give the impression of being in office, but not in power.
And very often that's the way it is for politicians. They attempt to kind of govern the country, but ultimately it's the bureaucracy and the judiciary that control everything. So let's just talk a little bit in brief about the different groups. So the first group is bureaucrats. So that's pretty much anybody. It can be in the private sector, but generally speaking, it's someone who works from the government and is responsible for something. This could be a food inspector. This could be someone who gives out parking tickets. This could be someone who approves home extensions, etc. And if you think about it, a lot of these people have absolute power of life and death over you, and you have virtually no recourse. One of the most prominent examples of this is traffic laws within municipalities. Municipal governments are infamous for passing absurd laws. Like some in cities where people I know have lived, they'll pass things like you can't park on the road outside of your house for more than 2 hours. You aren't allowed to park on the road overnight. You aren't allowed to park on the road between like September and April, even if there's no snow, because the snowplow might come by. Just stuff like that. There'll be, if you've ever been to Toronto, there's a billion different parking signs, many of which conflict with each other. And there's nothing you can really do about it because most of these people are not elected. Elected politicians can't really do anything about them, but they completely control how you live your daily life. Just some other kind of examples at the municipal level. Let's say you need to get your house renovated. For whatever reason, you often have to get a permit to renovate your own property. And the person there could just deny you, and you don't really have much of a recourse. And then you're screwed. And once again, there's stuff like if you own a restaurant, the health inspector has the ability to just shut you down, that sort of thing. If the government just decides, like some bureaucrat somewhere is like, oh, I think this would be a good place to resettle a bunch of refugees. Down the street from you, we're going to build a housing project there. Like, there's nothing you can do about that because that's done within the executive branch, that's done within the bureaucracy, that is completely isolated from political or public interference. So I suppose that's kind of what I mean when I'm getting at these are kind of the new forms of the ruling class. Because if you're a bureaucrat, like I said, how is someone supposed to take action against you for the decisions you make that impact their lives? Generally speaking, elected governments can't get involved with the civil service directly. And you as an individual, all you can do is complain and hope that maybe somebody thinks it's bad optics and goes against you, decides to help you out. So you have that, and that's both at, like I said, a very petty level, but also on a grand scale, where you have governments will just make decisions and say, oh, this company can commit this crime. This person doesn't have to, like, it's okay if this person commits this crime. It's okay if this other person commits this crime. And you don't have any recourse. Hopefully you understand what I mean. By recourse, I mean you can't vote the bureaucracy out of office. You can't, as a public person, do anything directly about them. They're just there. And if they want to stamp a particular piece of paper, they can ruin your life very easily. They can get you audited and then just misstamp the audit, and then you go to jail for tax evasion. They could decide to deny, I don't know, some, like I said, some tax credits, some forms, there's all kinds of things that you rely upon them for to keep up their end of the bargain and to file things in a regular and reliable fashion. And if they just decide they're not going to do that, then you're screwed. There's nothing you can do about it. The second group in question is the judiciary. Now, I was thinking about it the other day, and to be honest, the American Supreme Court probably has more power than any other institution I can think of in human history. Because the Supreme Court literally has the ability to declare anything, anything. Like, it doesn't have to make sense, there doesn't have to be precedent, and there's absolutely no check on their power. It's like the Supreme Court, if they were to rule tomorrow that the Constitution required everybody to wear pink shirts, that would be enforced. There's no recourse. You can't get rid of the Supreme Court. You can't override their decisions using some sort of elected assembly. The public can't vote them down. The Supreme Court in the United States can literally declare anything. Like in a lot of cases, states had passed constitutional amendments banning gay marriage. In many cases in which large majorities had voted for. And the Supreme Court of the United States just said, no, you can't do that. And this has happened throughout the world. In most cases where things like the death penalty get overturned, where abortion gets legalized, or where gay marriage gets imposed, it's very rarely through the actual government. It's almost always the Supreme Court somewhere overrules the popular will and imposes their standards on the country. And in a lot of cases, particularly like in America and Canada and probably Great Britain, the judicial branch or the judiciary has a critarchy that is in many ways more absolute and more all-powerful than the monarchs of old used to be. So you have these bureaucrats who can basically do anything they want and there's no recourse. You have the judicial system do anything they want and there's no recourse. And then you have corporations and you have people up in the business world. And once again, I think you can make a case that these people are the ruling class. And even though, like I said, none of these people necessarily come from some sort of super prestigious background. A lot of them are just kids who did well in school and they got a law degree and then they became a judge, or they did well in school, they got a public service degree, and then they went on and worked their way up through a ministry over the next 30 years. And business is much the same. If we look at who some of the most powerful people are in the world, like Mark Zuckerberg, they didn't necessarily come from extreme wealth, but they control immense amount of power. Mark Zuckerberg personally controls a sizable portion of the world's free speech. And there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing governments can do about it. Nothing. Like, he could just decide tomorrow to just shut it all down, to just shut down anybody who, and they've tried this periodically a bit, but just to go, anybody who has conservative on their Facebook political views, just ban them all. Just go back through everybody's social media, and if they've ever said anything like, I'm going to vote for the Conservative Party or something, kick them off. He has the power to do that. He has the power to fundamentally change public dialogue. And there's no recourse against him. And generally speaking, there is no recourse against companies. They can basically do whatever they want. You have to hope that one of the other two branches of the ruling class, being the bureaucracy and the judiciary, is willing to step in and do something to check the third branch, private corporations, but generally speaking, they aren't. And so you kind of have this incestuous relationship where you have these three unelected, unaccountable groups who can do anything they want, and people in practice have no recourse to it. But at the same time, it is kind of a meritocracy, because if you do really well in school, you know the right people, etc., you can become that next Mark Zuckerberg. You can have total power and total control. It can be anybody. To say that an integral part of modernity is ruled by the middle class is no exaggeration. As we continue to go through this unprecedented phase in human history, we really have to wonder if, when, or how will this end? Will society just continue on for the next 1,000 years with a portion of the middle class being given government positions or private sector corporate jobs, and those people being the ones who rule over the rest of us? Will you eventually get into a scenario where these people kind of become a generational elite, kind of like what they had in China, and you'll get into a scenario where there is de facto nobility and then there's everybody else, and then you'll kind of have a reversion to pre-modern times? It's really difficult to tell, especially when we have automation coming about. We may eventually have universal basic income. We really don't know, and it's going to be fascinating. But for now, we're living in modernity, and the rise of the middle class is one of the factors that led to the making of modernity.